During the Roaring Twenties, famous figures such as Langston Hughes, Louis Armstrong, and Aaron Douglas spread black culture like a wildfire that sparked in Harlem, New York, ultimately igniting a flame that spread throughout the country. The black poems, music, and art of the Harlem Renaissance became more popular throughout the neighborhood of Harlem, and by the early 1930s, Harlem became a haven for black culture and arts. The Harlem Renaissance began just after the Civil War and the emancipation of slaves. Many African Americans, through newfound freedom, made goals to participate in American society and eventually have an equal chance of getting jobs. This dream raged on for many years but faded away by the 1870s due to many white people believing that they were superior to everyone else, especially those of African American ancestry. In the South, groups such as the KKK were devoted to keeping African Americans from voting or exercising other fundamental rights. This was continued through Southern legislation, who made many decisions to segregate people of color in transportation and schools. This was later extended to parks, cemeteries, theaters, and restaurants. These laws were enforced to prevent contact between whites and blacks as equals, and were famously named the Jim Crow laws because of Jump Jim Crow, a famous character portrayed in blackface. Even though this was blatant discrimination, it was famously allowed by the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, stating that they should be, quote, separate but equal, but it never was. This led to much unrest, which led to many African Americans moving north in what was known as the Great Migration. The Great Migration was the movement of black Americans in hope for a better life in the North. This was due to many push and pull factors such as the Jim Crow laws and hate crimes committed against black families. The move north was also influenced by World War I, which showed many black soldiers freedom, and once they returned to the U.S. and had a taste, they became impatient with the discrimination. They realized they didn't have to be oppressed and discriminated against. This mentality became integral in laying the foundation for generations to come. The Harlem Renaissance was a time in the 1920s after many African Americans migrated to northern cities, especially Harlem, in search of opportunities. In the cities, black people expressed themselves in many ways, including poetry, music, theater, and many more arts. A unique philosophy that was held throughout the Renaissance was created by James Weldon Johnson. Through his long and varied career, he began to believe that to combat racism and achieve equality, black Americans should create literature and art to demonstrate equality through intelligence. The Harlem Renaissance was built on figures, one of the most prevalent being Langston Hughes, who was known for his portrayals of black life in the mid-1900s. He wrote books, plays, short stories, and poetry. He is also known for his influence on jazz. His fame came to be because, unlike many famous poets at the time, such as Claude McKay, Gene Toomer, and Countee Cullen, he didn't want to differentiate between his experiences and that of the common experience of black America. Jazz was very important to the movement and originally reached New York from southern towns like New Orleans and St. Louis before World War I. Famous musicians on the vaudeville circuit like Ma Rainey popularized jazz in American culture, which reached New York at Proctor's 23rd Street Theater. Jazz was spread to the rest of the world through James Reese Europe, who introduced European audiences to jazz using the Army Regimental Band. After, artists, most happening to be African Americans, signed with black recording labels, but eventually got popular enough that they signed with more mainstream recording labels, such as Paramount Columbia. This led to the addition of jazz into popular comedies and theater. Jazz created a totally new facet of the music industry and became one of the most popular genres of music at the time. During the Harlem Renaissance, nightclubs were an integral element, since they allowed black musicians to perform in front of an audience, which spread black culture and music throughout Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance was a very important time in American history and also led to important events later down the line. The Harlem Renaissance was a time when black people worked together and found freedom of expression. This gave African Americans expanded opportunities to express themselves. After the Renaissance, the first show on Broadway, which included African Americans, was called Shuffle Along, and it opened on 63rd Street Musical Hall. It was written by Flournoy Miller, Aubrey Lyles, and composers and singers U.B. Blake and Noble Sissle. It was directed exclusively by African Americans. Poets such as Langston Hughes saw Shuffle Along, and the play redefined the music and nightlife scene in Harlem. White Americans also saw the play, and it introduced them to black music, theater, and entertainment. Another major thing that Shuffle Along did was bring jazz to other parts of New York, as well as incredible choreographing and performing. It ended up being a major success and created a chain of 9 more African American plays throughout Broadway's history, which were directly created by the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance also led to many people being inspired, such as Jacob Lawrence, who made a series of 60 paintings about the Great Migration in the early 40s, in particular the movement of African Americans from the North to South. This was directly due to the Harlem Renaissance creating trailblazers for young African Americans to follow. Harlem Renaissance artists would go to Europe as they saw it as an important part of their training in art. Although there was oppression by the European people, there was no legalized segregation, which gave artists that were vital to the new Negro movement a sense of greater personal freedom. An artist that did this was known as Archibald Motley, who was able to go to Paris because of a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1929. His paintings were mainly the cafes and nightlife of France. Although he was born in New Orleans, he had the ability to speak a Creole version of French, which allowed him to communicate with Black Caribbean Parisians. Paris's nightlife caught Motley's interest, which he preferred over an old-fashioned jazz circuit in America. His and many other Black artists' works were regularly in European galleries, but never in any museum collections. Harlem today is still a haven of culture in Black New York, with jazz and food at heart. If you ever visit Harlem, you will feel like the culture has always been a part of you. All the street names are named after famous figures to enshrine them in the city forever. Harlem isn't a normal city, it is uniquely Harlem, and it is the epitome of all the figures who left their stamp on the city forever. It isn't the same as the Renaissance, but you can find the Renaissance on every street and building. Harlem Renaissance was also very important because it was credited for the birth of today's rap and hip-hop. Langston Hughes mixed 2 of the most important pillars of the Renaissance, jazz and poetry, and created jazz poetry, which is based on rhythm melodies. Jazz poetry includes rhythm and improvisation just like jazz, but with the addition of descriptive lyrics like poetry, which is by many the birth of today's rap. These were some of the impacts we still feel today, but there are even more. The Harlem Renaissance brought popularity to African American arts, while also inspiring future Black individuals. The life, identity, and culture that was brought to the world because of the Harlem Renaissance revolutionized world culture on a large scale. It also challenged the racial stereotypes in the South, which then changed the African American experience, as well as the view on the African American race. The Renaissance didn't achieve socio-political transformation, but it did establish authority for Black writers and artists. It did this over representation of culture and experience, and made a space that is expanded to this day for writers and artists in Western high culture. The Harlem Renaissance gave Black Americans role models that they could look up to. And late into the 1960s, up until now, Black artists continue to be prominent. The Harlem Renaissance created a new sense of spirit and pride that provided a foundation for the civil rights movement, as well as showing that art can be used to improve the lives of Black people. Many people had different thoughts on the Renaissance. Some thought the artists had to show a respectable image of Blacks to white society. They thought art should be used for political means, not just to express themselves and sacrifice the ingenuity of the art. The Harlem Renaissance was a time of spirit and opportunity. It also showed audiences the issues of race in America, which are very important. An example of this is the Chinaberry tree, which tells the story of a Black woman who gave birth to a child of a wealthy white man. It was set apart from the African American community because of the interracial relationship, while also making the main character Sal's family privileged because the book explored her searches for love, which was a recurring theme in all of Jessie Redmond Fawcett's novels. Before the Harlem Renaissance, people had minimal exposure to Black culture, and if it hadn't been for this event in history, the world we live in possibly wouldn't be the same as we see it today. The Renaissance impacts many people, especially those in the African American community. Many famous figures from the African American community wouldn't be prominent today without the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance created new styles of art and opened doors for creativity. Through the efforts of the Harlem Renaissance, we have gained an understanding of Black culture, and it has been integrated into our society, showing the importance of freedom of expression. Harlem Renaissance was a time of spirit and opportunity that should be cherished through its impacts on culture throughout the last century.